We're going to get into our discussion of the trauma of racism, just to set the table a little bit before our discussion. First slide here. The result of, these are all historical factors that are leading to where we are right now, starting with chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and lynching, all three shameful things that contributed to where we are right now with traumatic racism in this country. Legal and de facto discrimination and oppression, these sort of institutionalized things that we all come against, employment and educational discrimination, poverty, social alienation, and hate crimes, all contributing to this state that we're in right now. In the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, unjust imprisonment, racially biased justice system, school to prison pipeline, and discriminatory policing, all of these sort of institutionalized barriers to folks living their best lives and contributing to this diagnosis that we're going to be talking about. Finally, we're looking at incarceration in New York. As of January in 2014, more than 53,000 New Yorkers find themselves in the custody statewide of a correctional facility. 95.6% of them were male, 45% from New York City immediately, and just under half of those folks were Black, with white and Latinos making up 23% and about 24% respectively. So this is all just setting the table for, I'm going to take you back to our beginning slide, the trauma of racism. So now that we've sort of given you a little bit of background, let's get into the A block. I totally whiffed that, I'm sorry.
So in broad outline form, Brian's just given us the causes and the effects of the trauma of racism. Here now to help us understand the reality behind those bullet points are Dr. Kirk A. James, who teaches at Columbia University and has written extensively about mass incarceration and racial injustice. Doctor, thank you very much for being on BK Live.
Thank you. And
we want to welcome to BK Live 5, Mualimm-ak, a former prisoner who is the co-founder of the Incarcerated Nation Corporation. He's also a Columbia Justice Scholar and a human rights advocate who's involved with post-incarceration redirection. Thank you both very much for being here on BK Live. Let's get right into the issue, if we can, for people who may not know or for people who may know. Let's just talk about what are the many ways that the trauma of racism presents itself.
Well, I think the slides were really a good starting point, right? Just understanding that let's go back to maybe even the end of slavery, right? And what the 13th Amendment was supposed to, in theory, mean. It was supposed to mean a new beginning for people of color in the United States. But what happened was, and many people are totally unaware of this, the 13th Amendment actually had a clause that slavery could continue in the form of arrests and convictions. And then pretty soon after that, you saw black codes, essentially laws that were essentially targeted towards people of color post-slavery, right? And you started to see just a magnitude of people of color being incarcerated, specifically for poverty, specifically for lack of education, all the things that we know like were a byproduct of slavery. And 100 years later, 200 years later, we still see those same experiences.
So Five, how is that manifesting itself in Brooklyn right now? Because when you start in with saying, oh, when you look at slavery or when slavery was abolished, there's people, Black included, who are like, oh, I wasn't a slave. Like, my grandmother wasn't a slave. But how are we still feeling the ramifications of that?
You know, we don't look at felt oppression, the things that control our environment and our communities, as directly imposing upon us, right? And those effects, as they trickle down, I think lack of education, also lack of history with our youth as well, doesn't understand that these struggles have come from a longer standing battle. So we still see the effects, right? Mass incarceration, the biggest municipal police force stop and frisk still happening, racial discrimination, all while not understanding that this marginalized population is already attacked by the system, right? We have a huge population of people who live post-incarceration, a different caste system, and they're younger and younger today. So the youth today, that population that you're talking about, 21 or 22 to 25 years old, majority have experienced incarceration, is already disenfranchised from even voting from the country that they want to be a part of when they grow up.
So how can communities kind of begin to measure the impact of this trauma on themselves?
Well, I think the idea is that communities have already understood something was happening, right? And for me, coming of age in the 90s, and I listen to hip hop, and so much of hip hop is speaking about like the trauma of oppression, the trauma of mass incarceration, Wu-Tang Clan's Cream, 40 of us in the back of a bus, life is a shorty, shouldn't be so rough. But as the world turns, I learn life is hell, living in a world no different from a cell. So, communities have already had this understanding. I think in many ways it's kind of sad that we have to kind of like research, you know, like the experiences that people have spoken about for hundreds of years. So I think people already have the experience and understanding of what's happening. The idea, though, is to name it. Right, to name it, like trauma. This is why I'm feeling angry. This is why I'm feeling depressed, you know, and tie that into systems. Because so many people, the people that Five spoke about, they've internalized the struggle. So instead of seeing that, you know what, you're living under this very oppressive regime, you know, that has kind of like created a racialized caste system, people have made their failures or their successes primarily their own responsibility, right? So it's how do we find this balance? How do we find this balance of like understanding and analysis?
So in this country, we don't have a great history of dealing with mental trauma.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or even innate mental deficiencies that we have, like we lock people away or we ignore it. So we've sort of contextualized folks who came home from war with post-traumatic stress, and they're starting to get treatment. How do we institutionalize a way to treat people who seemingly had free will and then wound up in a system that only validated that trauma and exacerbated it?
I'm going to let Five answer this, but I want to say something really quickly, right? So I think the idea is that there's so much stigma associated with like trauma, right? And especially when you think about people of color and the history in the United States with stigma and just like the labeling, right? So the first way is to kind of like create spaces where we normalize it, right? Where we, you know, where we bring this, you know, educational analysis, this empirical analysis with like really our stories, right?
So beginning even with languaging ourselves into it.
Absolutely. So to really demystify this stigma, right? Because we know mental health is such a prevalent issue in our communities, but because of the stigma, so many people of color are undiagnosed, right?
Well, listen, we have moms who are suffering postpartum depression and stigmatized after having a miracle happen. And you walk out of prison, you're an ex-con and all of these things. So tell us about making that bridge.
We have a client, Kimberly Brooks. She's incarcerated right now for committing a crime during postpartum depression. There's a large population of women incarcerated, right? But we don't look at incarceration as a traumatic experience, right? As a matter of fact, according to housing, it's considered willful. So when you come home, you only been homeless for one day, even if you've been dispatched from your community and ostracized from your family for 15 to 20 years, right? So this type of lack of services and help for returning citizens, because that is the name of a person who's returning citizens
instead of an ex-con.
Right.
Parolee,
There's actually going to be a huge publication coming out of Harvard soon called Returning Citizens.
Why is that important to make that distinction between an ex-con, a parolee, and a returning citizen?
Well, number one, there was a letter, of course, written by Eddie Ellis, the late Eddie Ellis, and he also stimulated and also gave us a kind of mantra to understand that labeling things is how we have been offended and how we have been incarcerated and punished so much, right? The incarceration dehumanizes you by putting a number on you instead of a name, right? By calling you a body instead of a person, right? So we try to say person incarcerated, human incarcerated, or someone who has been a prisoner, literally, right, in prison. So that term, returning citizens, is because that's what people are. When people leave Brooklyn, there's a reason why there's a table in every prison, and we have 60-something prisons with a Brooklyn table, right? We know that this huge population has been snatched from the community and placed inside of incarceration. And why is because we don't recognize the oppressions that happen that cause these effects to go, you know? So, and mental illness, you know, we have over 10 million people suffering from mental illness, right? Brooklyn being one of the largest boroughs, right? We don't have that type of therapy where we incarcerate people for having these issues, right? We incarcerate people for using drugs or being addicted to drugs or having issues inside the community that can be therapeutically resolved.
I just wanted to ask, what are some of your experiences generally and specifically that led to you founding the Incarcerated Nation Corporation?
I was incarcerated for many years. I also suffer from schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And when I came into incarceration, there was no assessment period, so I worked with the UNH to establish a type of system to assess people with mental illness. Also, I do post-incarceration redirection because when you come home living under the stigma of mental illness and living in a community that there is limited amount of services and resources for you, I qualify for disability, but I don't qualify for disability housing because I'm a felon. So we created unique housing, which is for MICA patients, right? These type of addresses is a normal occurrence. Roughly 2,000 people return directly from solitary every year. These type of traumatic experiences that we don't label as post-traumatic. We don't label as a system of trauma.
You're in corrections.
Right, you're in corrections,
But even this idea of it being post-traumatic is a fallacy, right? Because post-traumatic is implying that something has ended. the experience, the suffering, the oppression has never ended, right? They're still experiencing it, as Five pointed out. Coming out of prison, he's actually more stigmatized, right? And the challenges are now even more exacerbated. So this idea of like something post is actually not correct.
Can we talk about the sort of spectrum of the trauma? Because even if you are a law-abiding person or someone who's never had contact with it, you don't even necessarily have to be a person of color, but particularly for people of color. We watched Charleston and what happened to people of faith in a church. We saw Eric Garner, whose like almost last words were, "I'm sick of y'all doing this to me every day. Why do you," which is like classic trauma, just speaking. And all of these instances of every anonymous, faceless black person who's been shot or something done wrong to them or punched at a Trump rally even. How does this go into our collective psyche?
Absolutely.
Are we all
impacted?
just like on the face of it, black and white, impacted by that?
Absolutely. So I think, I love James Baldwin because he was one of the first people, maybe without the language of trauma, to speak about, the impact of oppression. If we all live under oppressive society, we're all being impacted. Black, white, purple, everybody in between is being impacted, right? So trauma looks different for everyone. We all have different levels of resiliency. We all have different levels of coping mechanisms. But I think something that's really indicative of the level of trauma in the United States is the usage of drugs, right? So it's like, I remember working with a young man one time who'd been arrested over 50 times for drugs, right? And had been in and out of substance abuse programs. And he said, the reason why this doesn't work is because they're trying to treat the drugs. But it's not the drugs I'm trying to get away from. It's the experience. It's this experience as a man of color living in a very oppressive society, right? And I think when we look at, legalized drugs, right? What are they treating? Depression, anxiety, things as such. So we're all having this very collective experience that something is wrong, that this doesn't feel right. It impacts us on different levels, but it's like we need to have these conversations because we're all being impacted.
How do you think these conversations are going to affect mass incarceration as we move forward?
Just the recognition, even.
Yeah, I think just a recognition, but then also, as Five alluded to create more trauma-informed policies, to create more trauma-informed practices, right? So even the idea of culpability looks a lot different when we understand what trauma does to the brain, when we understand that there's a neurological shifting that happens in the brain.
But I'm sorry, if we are stuck in systems that were created to do these very things, how can we rely on those systems to undo what they were created to do?
Well, I don't think we're going to rely on those systems, and that's a great question. I think what we're going to do is we're going to put forward enough empirical evidence to really challenge those systems to a point where there is no choice but to change them.
Empirically.
Yes,
you
exactly.
Have studies just like you would any other.
Exactly. We're putting forward.
Not just about my field.
Yeah, I think, but the idea of validating people's experiences, right? Because there are millions of people who have had this experience, right? Generations after generation have spoke about suffering, living in America. So now to tie that with empirical data, we're holding systems accountable and saying, no, there needs to be this change. And it's also creating, I think, even greater, this collective awareness. When communities become empowered, then there's greater motivation for change.
So just Five, you're going to get the last word. I wanted to ask, if we're talking about this collectivity, how can you make the person who's watching right now understand that this is their problem as well? Because there's someone watching the TV saying, I don't care, you shouldn't have done anything bad to wind up in jail. That's not my problem if you don't feel well.
Well, if you understand the conditions of incarceration, how people end up there, and the empowerment in the community, and also the problems that happen when a person is inside that permanently stigmatize them and also puts them into a caste system that will cause them to reoffend again, right? Or you didn't learn your lesson the first time, which people even get more angry and more of a punishment system is on, because the sentences are now higher from your second offense, right? Because we don't have a proper system where the community welcomes you back. When we say returning citizens, these are people that come right back to the same community that they left from, but the same community doesn't absorb them, right? It doesn't understand that these irreparable damages that happen, right? Financial institutions, you can't live in city property, government property, federal property. You can't get an FHA, first-time home buyer's loan. If you're living with mental illness, we don't even have mental health facilities to address those people therapeutically. So when we talk about returning citizens, we're talking about the same people in our community that were trapped up and left, from the same problems, poverty. Until we get to those root issues and understand why people were affected to do the actions they did, then we can't continue to blame them.
Cycle.
Right, it's going to be a same old cycle. So we have created a system to fully support by integrating colleges and universities to help support those returning citizens, to make sure that each one that comes home is back in our community safely, right? And that takes therapeutic models. That takes recognizing the trauma that a person has gone through.
Well, if the community exists, yesterday we did something about incarceration and gentrification, but
Right.
you'll have to go to YouTube and check out that conversation because we're completely out of time. But thank you for scratching the surface with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so
thank you
much.
for the work you
Appreciate
do,
it.
and thank you for
Yes.
being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.